One of the major political issues of 2024 was how bad the US economy was. This argument usually revolved around some combination of the inflation rate and the cost of living. It formed the backbone of Trump's presidential campaign, and many a media outlet ran stories talking about the economic anxieties of the American people and the poor state of the overall economy. However, when looking at the usual metrics, the US economy was reasonably good, especially compared to other developed economies around the world. Inflation had dropped further and faster, from a US peak of 9.1% in June 2022 to under 3% by July 2024. GDP growth was higher, unemployment stayed around 4%. Even after adjusting for inflation, wages in 2024 were actually higher than they were in 2019, and those economic benefits weren't skewed by gains at the top of the economic ladder. Broken down into 10% blocks, all 10 income brackets in the US saw wage growth from 2019 to 2024, with the largest percentage gains concentrated in the poorest 10% of Americans, with real wage increases of 13.2% on average. Again, that is after adjusting for inflation. Speaking frankly, much of this can be credited to Joe Biden and the Democratic Senate and House, and the series of major bills that were passed and signed into law in 2021 and 2022. The American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. The last of these bills was the much scaled down and salvaged effort of the Build Back Better Act that failed in the Senate on account of Joe Manchin. Honorable mention to Kristen Sinema, who didn't publicly block the bill, but given her positions on the Inflation Reduction Act, we can safely assume she would have blocked the Build Back Better Act if Manchin had not. In addition, when it comes to polls and surveys during 2024, a majority of the population, when talking about their personal economic circumstances, expressed reasonably high satisfaction. A Federal Reserve poll going back to 2013 showed over 70% of Americans answering living comfortably or doing okay financially in 2024, which has been fairly stable going all the way back to 2016. The poll peaked in terms of economic satisfaction in 2021 at 78%. With these seemingly rosy economic indicators, why was there such a focus on the glum economic picture? From a motive standpoint, the media, and especially the Trump campaign, did not benefit from talking about how good the economy is, so they're going to focus on the negatives. But that's not really what I want to talk about here. I want to talk about the deeper economic conditions that the usual economic math can hide. First and foremost, overall macroeconomic indicators can all be great without it benefiting the majority of the population. The USA has been experiencing that set of circumstances for much of the last year and a half. Stock market numbers have been very high, and GDP has continued to grow, though with Trump's war of choice against Iran and the cutting off of trade from the Strait of Hormuz, we will see how long those trends continue. So I'm going to go back to that statement I said earlier about all economic brackets seeing increased wages between 2019 and 2024. First point. Especially at the lowest end of the pay scale, just because one has received a large increase in pay doesn't mean one is now financially secure. To keep the math easy, if you make $20,000 a year and have a 25% raise, which is double the real increase that happened for the poorest 10% of Americans, by the way, you now make $25,000 a year, which is still less than halfway to a middle-class income in the United States. Very understandable why, even with such on-paper good numbers, why this section of Americans would still feel dissatisfied with the state of the economy. Second point, if you zoom back in and look at wage increases versus inflation month to month, the bulk of this wage growth took place in 2020 and 2021. It was during 2021 and lasting until the spring of 2023 that inflation outpaced wage growth and ate into the wage increases that took place before inflation spiked. Even though wage increases started to outpace inflation again in June 2023, the relative wage gains were much smaller. In addition, by 2023, the rate of inflation had dropped from the highs of 2021 and 2022, but its effect on prices remained. Most people either aren't aware of this element of inflation, or it isn't intuitive when making purchases. For example, most people will look at something costing 20% more in 2024 than it did in 2022, and intuit that inflation is high, even if that item costs the exact same as it did in 2023. In this example, the 2023 to 2024 inflation rate would be 0, even though the price is still 20% higher than in 2022. So I would argue, for many people, when they talk about inflation still being high, they're talking about the prices remaining high after the period of high inflation. For many people in the US, they expect the broad increase in prices during high inflation to go back down again as the sign that inflation has ended. But that's not how modern economies function. In fact, if prices across the whole economy decline in a process called deflation, that is usually accompanied with an economic depression. For example, the last time the United States experienced widespread deflation was in 2009, during the height of the Great Recession. The time before that? The 1930s, during the Great Depression. Side note, deflation can happen in certain industries without it being a problem for the overall economy. For example, televisions are much cheaper now than they were 30 years ago. Certain perishable goods, like eggs or tomatoes, can vary wildly in price because of disease, weather, or seasonal availability. Oil can also vary in price without being directly tied to inflation or deflation, though in that case, a steep increase in the cost of oil will have the effect of driving up the overall inflation rate because of oil's use in transporting, well, everything. This is particularly relevant for where we are in the middle of 2026. But let's go back to 2024 and folks' experience of their fiscal circumstances. Even if on paper, the majority of people were financially better off in 2024 than they were in 2019, for a large percentage of people, their recent financial circumstances in 2024 were also worse than they were in early 2021, before inflation rates increased dramatically, which was also before the withdrawal of COVID-19 economic relief. So even though over 70% of Americans considered their current financial circumstances to be living comfortably or doing okay, for many of them, their recent personal finances were going in the wrong direction. Quick tangent on the withdrawal of COVID-19 economic relief, because one of the most important provisions was the expanded child tax credit, which both increased the total amount of money one could claim and allowed for poorer families to claim the full amount, even if they didn't pay that much into the tax system. The net effect of this policy was it cut child poverty in the United States in half in a single year. But it also only lasted a single year, 2021. President Biden wanted to make it a permanent change and pushed Congress to do so. However, it couldn't get through the Senate because Joe Manchin, him again, refused, with his reasons being it would increase inflation and it keeps people from working. The effect of the end of this program? Child poverty shot back up from just under 6% in 2021 to over 12% in 2022. Keep in mind, it was not just those in poverty impacted by the cut of this program. The full benefit applied to every family with a household income of $150,000 or lower with children. Millions of middle and lower class families saw their finances take a hit with the end of the expanded child tax credit. I would argue, alongside inflation, this financial loss for millions of American families was a primary driver to why so many felt, on the basis of their own financial experiences, that the US economy was going in the wrong direction. By 2024, the average American family had still not recovered from the 2021 financial peak, a peak that existed in part from the government expanded child tax credit. And this is despite the finances of American families improving from 2022 to 2023, and then again from 2023 to 2024. That many Americans believed 2019 or earlier was the previous economic peak, or that Trump's policies would bring back 2021's economic security, well, there's a whole host of reasons why people would believe that. Certainly a big one is that despite all evidence to the contrary going back decades, a majority of Americans believe the Republican Party is better than the Democratic Party for the overall economy. On a national level, unless you're in the top 1 to maybe 5% of income earners, the last time the Republican Party was better than the Democratic Party on the economy was Eisenhower? Taft? It's been a while. Another reason is that plenty of voters attribute their current economic troubles, no matter the source, to the party in power, especially the party of the president in power. Many blamed President Biden for the high inflation of 2021 and 2022. But high inflation was a global problem, and the USA had it less bad than most developed economies. But just because it wasn't Biden's fault didn't mean people weren't struggling. I will use that to lead into a final economic indicator that isn't really talked about, but I believe explains the general sense of economic anxiety that was felt in 2024. Now, I first ran across this in May 2025, while working on another script that was ultimately scrapped. In a video by Belle of the Ranch, she talked about a report from the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity. They use a measure called the Minimal Quality of Life Index, or MQL, which goes beyond just necessities and is more reflective of a lifestyle we would consider the basics of being middle class. Running the numbers, in 2023, 60% of households in the US did not meet the MQL threshold to be in the middle class. I bring this up here at the end as it isn't a metric typically used to determine popular satisfaction with the economy, but it is a much better measure of how many households are financially at a middle-class standard of living in the United States. What would that financial standard mean for a couple with 2 children? In 2023, a household would have needed an income of $120,000 per year to meet the minimum MQL threshold. In contrast, a couple with no children only needed an income of $73,000. A couple with 1 child, a little over $100,000. Side note, if you're wondering why fewer people in the US are having children, this is a large part of it. For a young couple, if you make $90,000 a year, you go from comfortably middle class with no children to falling out of the middle class entirely with just 1 child. Unless you really want kids, this financial reality is one that leads a lot of couples in their 20s and 30s to decide to postpone or simply not have children at all. So by most other metrics, the economic numbers for the US in 2023 and 2024 look good, and the answers to polls indicate reasonable economic security. But MQL is a way of illustrating how most people experience the US economy is worse than these traditional economic numbers would indicate. And I would argue introducing MQL as a regular economic indicator would be wise not only for those running political campaigns, but also for those trying to run a country. Unfortunately, this perception and for many reality of a stagnating or worsening economic situation was a major contributor to Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 election. All the worse because the policies Trump advocated for during the election would make the economic situation worse. Tariffs on imported goods, canceling green energy projects, repealing the CHIPS and Science Act, and while impossible for a president to actually do, promising to undo all the inflation of the previous few years on day one. And since Trump won, we are seeing the negative effects his economic policies were bound to have. A rise in prices on imported goods, a general increase in the overall inflation rate, and huge job losses, not only from the economic uncertainty of Trump's tariffs, but also from job cuts to the federal government. Over 300,000 lost government jobs in total, just from 2025. These negative economic trajectories have been made all the worse by his voluntary war against Iran, not only in the United States, but also for the global economy. And that, to me, is the real tragedy of 2024. The US economy, given the long-term investments from the CHIPS and Science Act and Inflation Reduction Act, alongside a declining inflation rate, was on the cusp of broader economic revitalization, but the benefits hadn't really arrived yet. Sure, on paper, most Americans were better off in 2024 than 2019, but it certainly didn't feel like it after 3 years of high inflation, especially in combination with the removed economic supports the US government provided as a response to COVID, most of which came to a sudden end in 2022 at the same time inflation was spiking. So ultimately, I would argue the USA's 2024 economy wasn't as bad as people think, especially not as bad as a lot of the media and presidential campaigns portrayed, but the technically broad economic improvements from 2019 to 2024 couldn't overcome decades of economic stagnation for the majority of Americans. And unfortunately, this has left us with President Trump, whose policies have had the exact opposite effect of what those who had voted for him hoped for.